The exploitation of African athletes in international sports is a complex issue rooted in economic imbalances, lack of representation, and systemic inequities. However, Africa has the power to change the game. Welcome back to One Africa Show, where we explore the crucial issues shaping Africa's future. I'm your host, Patrick Newman, and today we continue our important series, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation. This series focuses on the challenges Africa faces in taking its rightful place on the global stage, offering solutions to ensure the continent is heard, represented, and empowered. Today in Chapter 10, Sports Representation, Unequal Deals and Contracts, the Exploitation of African Athletes in European and American Sports. For decades, African athletes have been among the world's best, dominating global sports like football, basketball, athletics, and boxing. Their immense talent and skill have contributed significantly to the global sports landscape. But despite their success, many African athletes face systemic exploitation in European and American sports industries. Today, we'll look at how the structural inequalities in these industries create conditions where African athletes often receive unfair contracts, inadequate support, and limited control over their professional careers. One of the most glaring issues is the recruitment of young African footballers by European clubs. Many of these athletes are lured to Europe with promises of lucrative careers and success. But the reality is that only a fraction ever achieve long-term financial stability or success. The system is stacked against them, and unscrupulous agents often exploit these athletes by securing contracts that favor clubs and agents rather than the players themselves. Young footballers, particularly from West Africa, often leave their home countries to pursue opportunities in Europe. However, when they fail to meet performance expectations, many are abandoned with no support to fall back on. Unscrupulous agents who initially promise success vanish, leaving the young athletes stranded in foreign countries with limited resources and little to no options for career recovery. But it's not just football that's affected. Across all sports, there are disparities in earnings that highlight the systemic exploitation of African talent. African athletes contribute equally, if not more, to the success of their teams, yet they frequently earn significantly less than their European or North American counterparts. And when injuries occur or when performance declines, many African players are discarded without any financial or social support, creating a cycle where their wealth and success are short-lived. One of the primary reasons for this exploitation is the underrepresentation of Africans in key sports governance institutions. Despite Africa's vast talent pool and immense contributions to global sports, the decision-making in organizations like FIFA, the International Olympic Committee, IOC, and professional sports leagues remains dominated by Western executives. In football, for instance, FIFA, the body that governs the world's most popular sport, has had limited African representation in its leadership. Even though the Confederation of African Football, CAF, exists as Africa's governing body, it is still financially dependent on FIFA, which limits its ability to make independent decisions that could benefit African players and leagues. Similarly, in basketball, while African players have made significant impacts on the NBA, African ownership and executive representation within the league are still minimal. The creation of the Basketball Africa League, BAL, in partnership with the NBA, was a step forward, but African stakeholders still have very limited influence over the league's operations and revenue distribution. When it comes to the Olympics, Africa has consistently produced world-class athletes, particularly in long-distance running and boxing. However, African athletes still face huge disparities in sponsorship, funding, and training facilities when compared to their Western counterparts. Kenyan and Ethiopian long-distance runners, for example, dominate international marathons, yet they receive far fewer financial rewards and endorsements than their European and American peers. Similarly, African boxing champions struggle to gain global recognition and commercial deals despite their immense talent. Let's take a closer look at some specific case studies that highlight how the exploitation of African athletes in global sports is a deeply entrenched issue. 1. Football, the European market's exploitation of African talent. Football is Africa's most prominent sport, with millions of young players aspiring to join the ranks of the greats in Europe. However, the talent pipelines from Africa to European clubs are riddled with exploitation. Many young African players are scouted and signed to contracts that provide them little security and support. Those who fail to secure permanent spots on teams often find themselves abandoned without financial resources or guidance to rebuild their careers. For every success story like Samuel Eto'o, Didier Drogba, or George Weah, there are countless young players who fall victim to exploitative contracts, limited legal protections, and a lack of support systems. These players often return to Africa with little to show for their years in Europe, facing limited opportunities for reintegration into society and their local communities. 2. Basketball, the African influence on the NBA and limited African ownership. The NBA has seen an influx of talented African players, such as Hakeem Olajuwon, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Joel Embiid, who have greatly influenced the game. However, despite this tremendous influence, African representation in the NBA's governance remains minimal. The establishment of the Basketball Africa League, BAL, is a positive step, but more needs to be done to ensure African voices are central in shaping the future of African basketball. African basketball leagues still face challenges in developing infrastructure, obtaining sponsorships, and attracting the right resources to nurture and retain talent. While the NBA's influence in Africa is growing, African leagues must become more self-sufficient in order to nurture their own talent rather than relying on Western systems to discover, develop, and benefit from African talent. 3. The Olympics, African athletes and unequal opportunities. The Olympic Games showcase the best athletes in the world, and African athletes have consistently excelled in events like long-distance running and boxing. However, African athletes face significant challenges in securing sponsorships, training facilities, and the financial support they need to compete at the highest levels. In many cases, African athletes must train under suboptimal conditions, with limited access to the state-of-the-art resources available to their Western counterparts. This disparity in resources often leads to African athletes having to work harder with fewer tools, yet their achievements are still often overshadowed by the financial rewards and recognition granted to Western athletes. So, what can be done to combat this systemic exploitation and create more equitable and fair opportunities for African athletes? Here are some key strategies for African-led sports management and business models that could transform the landscape. 1. Developing stronger domestic leagues. To reduce dependence on European and American markets, African countries must strengthen their domestic leagues. Investment in local football, basketball, and athletics leagues will provide athletes with viable career options within Africa reducing the need to chase opportunities abroad. This will also help develop local talent, create jobs, and improve infrastructure. 2. Increasing African representation in sports governance. African nations must push for greater representation in FIFA, the IOC, and the NBA. By securing executive positions and influencing policy decisions, African stakeholders can advocate for fairer treatment of African athletes, improve governance, and better economic opportunities. 3. Implementing athlete protection policies. Governments and sports federations must establish stronger legal frameworks to protect young athletes from fraudulent agents and exploitative contracts. Strict regulations on talent scouting and contract negotiations can ensure that African athletes are treated fairly and are given the opportunity to thrive in their careers. 4. Expanding sponsorship and funding for African athletes. African corporations and governments must invest in sponsorship programs and initiatives that support local athletes. By fostering homegrown support for African sports, athletes will be less reliant on foreign endorsements and can retain greater control over their careers and earnings. 5. Establishing African-owned sports media and broadcasting networks. One of the reasons Western leagues dominate African sports is their control over media. Establishing African-owned sports broadcasting networks will elevate domestic leagues, ensure that African sports are marketed globally, and retain revenue within the continent. In conclusion, the exploitation of African athletes in international sports is a complex issue rooted in economic imbalances, lack of representation, and systemic inequities. However, Africa has the power to change the game. By strengthening domestic sports leagues, pushing for greater representation in governance, and implementing athlete protection policies, Africa can ensure that its athletes thrive under fair and equitable conditions. Thank you for joining me on One Africa Show. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video, and stay tuned for our upcoming book, A Seat at the Table, Africa's Struggle for Representation, where we will continue to explore the issues and strategies that will shape Africa's future.